All right, welcome. Today we are diving into a really tough but fascinating idea from one of history's heavy hitters, John Calvin. He had this surprisingly systematic answer to a question we all have to face. What's the point of all the suffering in the world?
Let's just start there, with the question that everybody at some point asks themselves, right? Whether it's a huge loss, a major disappointment, or just the daily grind wearing you down, we all get to a point where we look up and ask, why does life have to be this hard?
Well, the 16th century theologian John Calvin, he had a really stark and, frankly, uncompromising answer to that. He didn't sugarcoat it one bit. For him, a difficult life wasn't some unfortunate accident. Nope, he believed it was an essential part of the entire plan.
So let's get into his first big idea. Calvin argued that for believers, a hard life isn't a bug in the system, it's actually a feature. You heard that right, it's a core part of the design.
He says that just like Christ's suffering was the central event of his life, his followers are basically destined to be shaped by that very same pattern of trial and hardship. The Christian life, he says, is meant to be what he calls a perpetual cross.
And here's where his logic gets really counterintuitive. In our world, we usually see suffering as a sign that something's wrong, right? Or maybe that we've been abandoned. Calvin just flips that completely on its head. He argues that the more afflicted we are, the more our fellowship with Christ is actually confirmed. It's not a punishment, it's proof that you belong.
Okay, so that leads to a pretty crucial question. Why? Why is this perpetual cross so necessary? If God is good, why would he design a life that's packed with hardship for the people who follow him?
Well, Calvin's answer really starts with his view of human nature. He believed that we are all born with this tendency towards what he called a stupid and empty confidence in the flesh. Now that's just a fancy theological way of saying we instinctively trust ourselves too much. Our own smarts, our own abilities, our own plans, we just overestimate our own strength.
So Calvin lays out this really clear three-step path to humility. First comes affliction. Whether it's poverty, illness, or some other disaster, it shows us just how weak we are. Second, we're humbled because we realize our own strength just isn't going to cut it. And third, that humbling forces us to finally learn what it means to truly rely on God's power.
But, and this is important, this whole process isn't just about breaking us down. It's actually about building something new in its place. For Calvin, suffering is designed to produce these incredibly positive, virtuous outcomes.
So instead of destroying us, Calvin says the cross systematically builds up a whole series of virtues that we probably couldn't get any other way. It wrecks our arrogance, it exposes our hidden hypocrisy, and it teaches us to depend only on God. It produces patience, it strengthens our hope, and, maybe most importantly, it teaches us how to be obedient.
And Calvin illustrates this whole thing with a really powerful metaphor. He compares our human nature to a spirited, mettlesome horse. If you just leave it in a field getting fat and lazy, it becomes wild and untamable. But with discipline, it can be guided. For Calvin, suffering is that necessary discipline.
So here's the crucial takeaway. The experience of pain itself isn't the whole story. For Calvin, the meaning of that pain is completely transformed when you understand the purpose God has behind it. It's really all about perspective.
This chart just captures the core idea perfectly. Look, judged by itself, poverty is just misery, plain and simple. But if you view it through the lens of God's favor, it becomes a path to heavenly riches. Exile on its own, it's a terrible fate, but with God, it's a way of being drawn closer into his family. Even death, the ultimate disaster, gets transformed into an open door to a blessed life.
So far from being a mark of shame or failure, Calvin reframes this kind of suffering as a badge of honor. He actually calls it the special badge of his soldiery, which is like a sign that you're on the front lines, fighting for what's right.
Now this brings us to a final and really critical distinction that Calvin makes about how we should actually experience all these trials. And this is where his thinking gets super practical and, for a lot of people, pretty surprising.
Because a natural question pops up from all this, right? Is the goal to just become a stone, completely immune to pain? Are you supposed to just grit your teeth and feel absolutely nothing? Calvin's answer to that is a hard no. He powerfully pushes back against the popular philosophy of his day, Stoicism, which taught emotional detachment. He calls it an iron philosophy that tries to strip away our very humanity. And he draws this incredibly sharp contrast here.
The Stoic ideal, on the left, is to become like a rock, deprived of feeling. But for the Christian, on the right, the goal is not to eliminate pain, but to find God's comfort in the middle of it. It's the difference between not feeling at all and enduring that feeling without breaking, a model Calvin says comes straight from Christ's own example of feeling sorrow.
And he really lands his argument with the ultimate authority, quoting Christ directly. If Jesus himself calls those who mourn blessed, then how on earth can sorrow be a sin? This completely dismantles the idea that feeling pain is some kind of sign of weak faith.
So, for Calvin, true Christian patience isn't the absence of a struggle. It's the victory within that struggle. It's this honest tension between our natural human sorrow, which just wants to run away from pain, and our commitment to godly obedience, which chooses to trust God's plan even when it really, really hurts. And in that conflict, he says, obedience ultimately wins out.
So this very challenging perspective leaves us with one final question to think about. If we accept Calvin's idea that suffering isn't random, but is actually a purposeful tool, then we really have to ask ourselves, what is it building in you?